We're on there. Are we live? Great. I'm sure the suspense has been killing our 3 viewers, but it's great to be here tonight. We've got a special guest in Crawford Gribben. But before I introduce him, we'll just say a few words about why we're here tonight. My name is Colin Campbell, and I'm the manager of Evangelical Bookshop. I'm joined tonight by Gary Richmond, who's doing the technology, and also a junior John Owen in young Daniel. And we're grateful for their support behind the scenes there. So tonight we're here to discuss this book, which is an introduction to John Owen. And I'm really grateful for my good friend Crawford Gribben to be joining us tonight. So very welcome, Crawford.
Thanks, Colin.
Thanks for coming.
Good.
Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this book and wider issues around John Owen's life, ministry and theology. So first of all, maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, we're in Belfast tonight. I teach in Belfast at Queen's. I've been working on John Owen, I suppose, for, I don't know, maybe about 10 years, seriously. And I did a book in 2016, which I believe we're giving away copies of tonight, Colin.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, good. So I did a book on Owen in 2016, and that was quite a long biographical study and maybe a little bit heavy duty. But I really wanted to do something that I thought would be more helpful for everyday people who might have heard John Owen's name and maybe be a bit curious about some of the things that he wrote about, some of which, you know, within evangelical churches especially, are widely talked about and celebrated. But I was aware that quite a lot of the reputation around Owen is quite forbidding. You know, he's seen to be quite a heavy duty theologian and so on. And I want to try something that would maybe be a little bit lighter and hopefully more accessible, and something that, you know, everyday people could pick up and hopefully enjoy. So the first book was, you know, structured around his biography, but the second book, much shorter, maybe about a quarter of the length, and much cheaper. In fact, there's 5 of them to give away tonight as well.
Yeah.
But it's hopefully presenting for readers how Owen thought their lives should be. So he's talking. I'm trying to talk about the way in which he thought about the ideal Christian life, really from birth to death and beyond.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Obviously, there's a chronology in terms of how you have written the book. So you start. I guess chapter 1 is really about the early days of a young life.
Yeah.
And do you want to tell us a little bit
Sure.
about how John Owen saw those early years?
Yeah. So
particularly in a Christian household?
Yeah. So the book is structured into 5 chapters. The first one is like a summary of Owen's own biography. And then the first sort of major chapter of the book is a book about his idealized view of Christian childhood. And so that chapter is talking about things like how children born into Christian homes, as Owen understood it, should grow up, and what he would expect them, how he'd expect them to be formed, and also what he would hope that they would have achieved, if you like, by the time they leave that home and go out into the world and on their own. And so the chapter starts, I suppose, obviously, by thinking about Owen as a writer about childhood. And I think in all of the many excellent books that have been published on Owen, I don't think anyone's ever really talked about him as a theologian of childhood. And I think one of the really interesting things about that particular theme is that one of the books that was not included in the 19th century edition of Owen's works that's kept in print today by Banner of Truth was a little book called The Primer. And the Primer was just a little, maybe 16, 20-page pamphlet that Owen himself wrote for children.
Yeah.
And it's a lovely little book. It's, it's ABCs, it's got some numbers, it's got some kind of phonetic spellings. That's interesting. We'll talk about phonetics in a minute. And lists of, lists of various things that he thought children should know about. But it also had, which I thought was quite moving actually, prayers for children. And he included prayers for children to say in the morning, prayers for children to say at night. And sometimes the view of Owen that we have is this really, demanding scholastic theologian. But here he is penning simple prayers for little children, to say their prayers as they go to bed.
Yeah.
And I thought that was particularly moving. I think one of the things that made it especially moving was that Owen wrote that book in 1652, by which point he had buried all 4 of the children he had had to date.
Yeah.
So at that point, as far as we can tell, he didn't have any children of his own.
Yeah.
So he was thinking about the loss of his own children as he was writing that little pamphlet.
And do you think that impacted his view of early years and how precious they are, and how, of course, he wouldn't have taken them for granted, having buried 4 of his own at that stage, and later all 10?
All 10, yeah.
And one wife?
Yeah, and one wife, yeah. I mean, Owen is very sparing when it comes to writing about himself. He's not one of these people that bears his soul. He's not an American, he doesn't bear his soul on the page. He's quite a private individual. Yeah. Even in his letters, we only have got some of his letters surviving, but he writes about some of his children in there. And he obviously enjoys his children. He writes about one of his sons called Matthew, who just loves eating fruit. That's the kind of observation he makes in his letters. So obviously, we don't have a lot of personal writings. There's no diary and so on to know what it was like for Owen to lose all 4 of his children, for the house suddenly to be childless again. But it must have made a difference. So the chapter talks about childhood devotion, if you like, or childhood religion or faith. I'm not quite sure how you would put it. Obviously, it talks about his changing view of baptism, which is something that, again, people contest whenever they think about Owen.
Well, we'll quickly move on from that.
Well, if you want to.
No.
But he wasn't a Baptist.
No.
But Owen was always he always believed in infant baptism, but he had different rationales for explaining why.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that that chapter talks about is just how children grow up within the church. So that for Owen, catechism, because he was writing his own catechisms through this period as well. The task, the family's task of catechism was something that would build up the child in understanding really basic, really basic Christian concepts, so that they could take that really basic knowledge into a church service and listen to him preaching, let's say, and take something out of that. And, it's interesting too, because Owen also wrote a lot about what church services should be like.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's not often emphasized when we think about that issue is that he thought they should be short. And he thought they should be short because he wanted children and people of limited concentration spans to take something away from it except boredom and frustration. So all of that is, I suppose, really what the first chapter is about, Owen's view of childhood.
Yeah. And then, of course, maybe just pause there, because it's interesting on the sort of written prayer comment that you made. I mean, he was a man he was obviously a great theologian, but he didn't use notes in the pulpit, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, that's really just come to light. So I mean, he publishes a lot of sermons, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And
so he had someone with shorthand.
Well, I think probably 2 things happen at different stages of his life.
Yeah.
So early in life, when he's in the 1640s and early 1650s, he was really, really into politics, and he was very, very politically connected. And in fact, he spent a lot of time preaching to MPs and advising MPs. And those sermons in the Banner of Truth edition are in volume 8, and they're incredibly long. And he's one of these preachers from the 17th century who tries to cram the entire body of divinity into a single sermon. And I mean, I've never tried to read out those sermons, but I can imagine I would be astonished if any of those sermons was less than 3 hours in duration. Now that means 3 hours was probably longer than what you're going to do tomorrow morning, let's say. But in the 17th century, it wasn't necessarily, that was not necessarily a long sermon.
Yeah.
In fact, Owen's neighbour in the 1640s was a Presbyterian minister called Ralph Jocelyn, and he left a really, really compendious diary. And he talks about what his church services were like. And he's got a note during winter, one Sabbath day during winter, he records the service starting, I think he says about 11 o'clock in the morning and ending at sunset.
Wow.
So, there was a lot going on there. So Owen preached those sermons. They're really, really long. I think he probably just wrote them up afterwards and tried to make something of them. But later in life, when he was a much older, I think probably much more experienced minister, preacher, pastor, Bible teacher, he preached really, really short sermons. Okay. So if you look at volume 9 of the Banner Truth Edition, those are compilations of notes that were taken by one of his listeners, a man called Sir John Hartop. And lots of his volumes of notes still remain unpublished. They're available in London. You can consult them in London. But Hartop wrote them down in shorthand and then wrote them up fully and kept them in these beautiful notebooks, 4 of which say remain in Dr. Williams' library in London. And he did that because he wanted to use them for his own devotions. And he was reading those sermons out one every week to his own family way into the 18th century. That was one of his preacher. But so, yes, to go to your point, yes, he did preach without notes. That's
so obviously, and prayers as well. So to pray extemporaneously in the pulpit and through his ministry, and then to write these down for children, it's it's a lovely thought actually that you did that.
So I mean, he writes a lot about prayer as part of his very extensive writing on the Holy Spirit. And one of the things that Owen says makes the new covenant different from the old covenant is 2 Corinthians 3, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And he contrasts that idea with the liturgical demands of old covenant worship. And he emphasizes that one of the great benefits of the new covenant is the gift of the Spirit. And the gift of the Spirit means that any Spirit-taught minister has got the capacity and in fact the freedom and responsibility to pray extemporaneously. And that's why he thinks that written prayer books and so on stifle the Spirit's work and actually cramp, if you could say, they cramp the style of the new covenant. That's how he would see it. But yet he can also write written prayers for little children. And he can also recommend the Lord's Prayer for little children, but he doesn't recommend the Lord's Prayer for adult believers because he says they've got the Spirit, they don't need these forms, but little children do. And we should recognize their capacity and work with that.
Yeah. So I guess following on from that, after this next section on youth, how Owen viewed the sort of youthful stage of development, we'll take a little break and maybe run a little competition or two, ask a couple of questions.
It's not going to be a lucky tip, is it?
No, we're much too Calvinistic for that. No.
I like competitions that are preordained.
Yes. So we've covered the early stage. So how did Owen view that next stage? Once obviously they've been nurtured, and what next?
So, as Owen would understand it, in the ideal Christian home, child is born, child is baptized, child is catechized, it's brought up within the fellowship of the local congregation, and at some point that child then goes off into the world on its own. So what does he think happens next? Well, we have a fair idea of how he approached thinking about what we would call the teenage years. Obviously that's a modern construction, but that moment between childhood and, if you like, full adulthood. And we know how Owen approached that because almost all of his preaching in the 1650s for 10 years of his life was to what we would call teenagers who were students in the city where he was based. He was working in Oxford at that point. And I think one of the things that's really striking about those sermons is how uncatechetical they are.
Okay.
That, again, to go back to the idea of freedom, these are very, very free discourses on very important theological topics. But Owen, he doesn't present them in any kind of hackneyed, stereotyped way. So, for example, he preached a series of sermons on communion with God, that theme of communion with God, and he kept thinking about that issue all the way through the 1650s, and eventually published those sermons maybe about 7 years after he preached them. But we've got notebooks of sermon notes taken by students, for example, who were following along his preaching Sunday by Sunday in St Mary's Church in Oxford, and so we get a real sense of how he's communicating to them, and he is desperately concerned to avoid the trap of thinking that just because someone is well catechized and just because someone knows the Bible, that they are actually a believer. And he's desperately worried that churches are promoting the idea that simply reading the Bible on its own somehow gives you a knowledge of God. He's really worried about that. So he preaches for spiritual realities all the time. And so, he uses really rich, evocative language. There's some real moments of poetic beauty, I think, in some of those sermons, some really striking passages. He also takes metaphors like, the very ancient Christian metaphor of the deity as a fountain. And in his book Communion with God, there's fountains everywhere. You could say they spring up everywhere, but there's fountains everywhere in that book. The Father's a fountain, the Son's a fountain, the Spirit's a fountain, the means of grace are fountains. It's really, really rich, and you almost get a sense he's having fun with it. He's really enjoying talking about the gracious, overflowing bounty of this God, whose person and whose three persons Trinity and whose work he is describing, and so he does approach theology, but he doesn't approach it. He doesn't talk about election in the terms that we might expect him to. He'll say things like, "Loving is choosing," which when you hear it like that, is just such an obvious thing to say, and it takes so much of the pastoral theological sting out of the idea of election to salvation. But loving is choosing. Owen says that's what you do. Why would God do anything different to that?
Okay, great. So maybe just pause for a moment, and we'll ask one or two competition questions, and then maybe we'll find out if anyone else has a question that they would like to ask. But firstly, would you like to ask a question?
There's two great questions, isn't there?
How many?
How many volumes did the Banner of Truth print in Owen's works in green?
Yeah. And how many in orange?
And the second question is, how many in orange?
Great.
Tough.
And we like our greens and oranges here.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
So if people could give us answers to those two questions, they're fairly straightforward. If you've been in a bookshop or a manse, or they're usually on the top shelf and they're fairly dusty.
Out of reach.
Yeah. We should have maybe asked the question: how many people have actually ever read the entire 16-volume set? I just gave away one of the answers. Yeah, great. Maybe another question while I look for a question here from the audience.
Sure. You want me to ask you a question?
You can ask the public a question, maybe.
All right. So, first of all, how many were published in green? How many are published in orange? And then the other question might be, how many were never republished at all? So it's just guess numbers, Colin. Hope that's all right.
Yeah. So we've got some comments here and one or two questions. Question for Crawford. Just wanted to get in early. This is from Stephen Steele, who is the Reformed Presbyterian minister in Stranraer. So we have identified him. So it better be a good question.
Is that not called doxing?
Yeah. Thoughts on the Gold Banner edition? Is it likely that the forthcoming Crossway Critical edition will contain a lot more content?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I was going to come to that later, so that's a great question.
That's a great question. I suppose the answer is, at this point, we don't really know. I think
we should give a bit of background for those who don't know it.
Yeah,
it's to be a 31.
I'm not sure how long it's going to be, but they're going to do everything.
And it's supposed to be 2021.
Is it? I'm not sure. I don't know, you know more than I do.
That's what I'm hearing. But
okay, but I know I'm excited by the fresh translations of his Latin works. I think that'll be really important.
Yeah.
I think all of the volumes are going to be given a scholarly introduction. They've never had that before, so that's great. And the third thing I think is very interesting is that, as far as I understand it, they're going to be coming out in modern English as opposed to 17th century English. So I think I think that could be a really good resource. But 31 volumes, I mean, that's just one short of the new Bloomsbury edition of Bart's Church Dogmatics. So, you know, if you've got two really high shelves, you've got to think carefully about which one goes on top.
Yeah. Stephen has a follow-up. There's one in Latin, not republished.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, is he trying to answer one of our questions?
I think he might be.
Yeah, he's always asking for free stuff, isn't he?
Yeah. So maybe we should just rule him out for running altogether.
Let's do that.
Okay, we'll come back to competitions and other questions after a little while. So we'll move on maybe with the book for now, and we'll move to chapter 3, which is Owen on
maturity,
middle life,
midlife crises.
Yeah. Did he advocate going out and buying a Ferrari and
motorbike in his case?
Yeah.
So the third big chapter, as you say, then is about this matter of how he envisages Christian life and maturity.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's two things there that I thought were interesting about that, his description of that phase of the ideal Christian life. And one is life within the church. You know, he writes, you know, very warmly about what church fellowship ought to be like, and you know, he describes in great detail both how an individual congregation should be organised, and also how a church service itself should develop. So I think that's really interesting. And as always with Owen, there's surprises, and we can maybe talk about some of those later on if you want to. But I think the second thing that was interesting about his description of midlife, if you like, is his discussion about how Christians should live in the world.
Yeah.
And you know, he changes his views on many issues a lot through his life, but his changing view of politics is fascinating, because he starts out in the 1640s at the tail end of the civil wars. You know, the revolution is happening. There's been this war between Parliament and King, and it's all about freedom. You know, and it's all that kind of grand rhetoric that revolutions often have when they're going well. And Owen identifies with that very closely, becomes a preacher for the army, takes part in the invasion of Ireland, then in the invasion of Scotland. You know, a lot of horrific things happen. You know, he's aware of that, I would imagine. But you know, he's certainly aware of the horrors of a wartime capital and what life is like in that kind of situation. And in those early years, his view of politics is quite simply that the godly should rule the world, you know, and that Christ will extend his kingdom by any means necessary, ideally through preaching and prayer, by the sword if necessary. And that seems to be his view. It's a very aggressive view of providence. Now, the thing about providence, as he later realizes, providence is really easy to interpret when it's going your way, right? But then, of course, he hits midlife, he hits his 40s, his early 40s, and everything disappears. So he invests his entire life in this revolution and this new Republican government, which he's, you know, very closely identified with. You know, he has sacrificed all of his youth and early adulthood for a political cause that, after the king comes to the throne and the revolution is ended, is an incredibly dangerous liability. People are being killed in the most horrific and public ways because of their association with this government. And, you know, he has to go into hiding. He splits his family up. He's got a few more children by that stage, but he can't live with them. They live in one house, he and his wife, and I think his youngest son live in another. And, you know, his view of politics has to take account of the fact that, as far as he sees it, God has turned his back on the godly, and that needs to be explained. And then also he's got to figure out, when this new government is intent on persecuting and quarantining former revolutionaries, anyone in fact who won't conform to the established church. He's then got to work out, well, how can dissenters, how can people live as religious dissenters who will abandon any prospect of living close to a major town? That was one of the rules. Who can abandon any prospect of success in universities or in professions because they were now prohibited, who can abandon any hope of influencing politics through military power or revolution and so on. And so he comes to understand then that dissenters have to understand that they are marginal. But also he wants to emphasize to the wider world that even if dissenters are marginal, they can still play in a really important life in the country. And so he begins to argue for religious toleration. And of course, influences one of his students in the 1650s, a man called John Locke, who then becomes one of the chief theorists of the kind of legal architecture of the Glorious Revolution and the promise of religious toleration that comes with that in England and later in Scotland and Ireland. So what role can dissenters play in society? He says, if the government frees you up, you can be a good neighbour, and you can make some positive contribution, even to a country that's determined to keep you suppressed.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. That's an excellent answer. That's superb. Now, in terms of church life, how did Owen view that? You've got a section in chapter 3 on that.
Yeah.
Would you like to go into that?
Yeah, sure. Again, I suppose it depends at what point in Owen's life you're talking about, doesn't it? So in his early years, you read some of the old 19th century Owen biographies, and they talk a lot about 2,000 people coming to attend his preaching in the 1640s, as if this was some kind of mark of great success or oratorical skill or spirituality or whatever it may be. In fact, they were legally obliged to be there and would have been fined had they not attended. So Owen moves from congregations of 2,000 people in his parish in the 1640s to 30 people in his little congregation in the 1660s as a dissenter. Now that little group of 30 people, I think, gives Owen the opportunity to think about what a church should be and what church life should be like. And again, you start reading the sermons he preaches to these people. These people are washed up Republicans. These are people who've also risked and lost everything in the cause of a political cause that no longer exists. Yeah. And these are people who've lost a lot, lost friends as well as material resources. And 30 of them eventually gathered together in a private home just outside London. And that's where Owen's preaching to them. And he's, in addition to preaching to them, he's preaching very simply, very warmly. He's taking individual Bible texts, trying to find encouragement as much as he can. But he's also writing books about how churches should worship. And Stephen Steele will be glad to know he writes extensively about the regulative principle. So the only way we can worship God is according to God's command. Everything else is just us doing what we feel like doing. So there's that. But then he asked the question, well, what does the regulative principle require? And of course, psalm singing, 3 cheers from Stranraer. Psalm singing, of course, exposition of the word, of course, baptism, of course, but also Lord's Supper. Well, then he asked the question, well, how often should we do this? How important should the supper be to nourish the spiritual life of Christian believers? And he says, actually, it's so important that we should be doing this every week. And I mean, I'm fascinated by that in so many ways because, again, it shows that Owen is not what we think reformed necessarily means. He's not taking us back to...
Although a lot of reformed folk do go for a weekly communion.
Yeah, so Calvin argued for it, but was never able to do it.
Yeah.
And I just think it's intriguing.
Yeah.
So he writes a lot about that. He also writes a lot about the call to the ministry. Basically says there isn't one. The call to be a teaching elder is pretty much the same as the call to be a ruling elder, as far as Owen's concerned. He's not really a mystic in that sense.
Yeah.
He and actually, his view of order in the church is really fascinating as well, because he actually advocates that Christians should come together to study the Bible, if necessary, without pastoral direction. So you don't need to study the Bible only with your minister present. You and a bunch of your friends can get together on an evening and just do it yourselves. And he says the reason I can trust Christians to do that is because of the ministry of the Spirit, who Jesus says promises to lead you into all truth. So that there's lots there that is
supported by his pulpit ministry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But even that, his view of pulpit ministry is fascinating, because he doesn't think that only ordained people, in fact, he'd be more specific, ordained men. He doesn't say that pulpit should be restricted to ordained men. He preaches alongside a man, John Sams, who's not even elected as an elder for a number of, I think, about 4 or 5 years. So, I think this is one of the reasons why it's kind of amusing that people think of Owen as this kind of bastion of Reformed orthodoxy, because he does his own thing a lot of the time. And of course he knows the confessions, of course he knows all the tradition, exegetical confessional tradition. He knows it better than almost anyone else in his century, as far as I can see. But he's not bound by it. Again, it's that new covenant idea of where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. He does feel free. And the question in his mind is not, what did Calvin say? Or more to the point, actually, from Owen's perspective, what did Augustine or Aquinas say? Those are his conversation partners. But actually the question is, what does the Bible say? And that's what he keeps coming back to. And he really does let the Bible contour the way he thinks about things. Sometimes that is that is an impediment to his fully identifying with confessional tradition.
Okay, got a couple of questions.
Right.
One of them is quite funny. So Sarah Perkins from London is asking repeatedly that we should ask her question.
Is it about Abraham Lincoln?
No, it's about guns found in in Owen's house.
Yeah.
How many guns were found?
How many?
Yeah.
6 cases of pistols, wasn't it? So I think.
How many pistols in a case?
I think there's 2 in a case, isn't there? It would be a dueling case.
Okay.
So 12.
So not enough to start a revolution, but a substantial.
No, not enough to start a revolution. But the revolution had just failed.
Yeah.
So the question is, why did he still have pistols?
Yeah.
And if it's cases of pistols, i.e., one for each person who intends to shoot each other in a duel, what's he doing with them? So just for context here, these pistols were found in Owen's house in 1661, I think, when his house was raided during a conventicle. So by that stage, he had moved back to his home in Oxfordshire, and he was leading private religious meetings, conventicles, and these conventicles were occasionally raided because they were actually illegal. And not only was he conducting illegal worship, he was also hoarding weapons. And of course, it's worth remembering he was arrested in 1683 or 1682, the winter of 82-83, on suspicion of plotting to assassinate Charles II. And at that point, Owen wasn't far off his deathbed, he wasn't found guilty in that. But his brother and his ministerial assistant, who was a Covenanter from Scotland, a man called Robert Ferguson, who was zany to the point of bizarre, and ended up actually as a Jacobite spy later in the 18th century. They were both real conspirators, and are almost more than plausible they were involved in this.
Okay. Interesting. So thank you. Another question. In the existing or surviving letters of John Owen, do any discuss how he planned to help those other Puritans who had ended up in prison? Bunyan, for example.
That's a good question. I can't remember offhand.
That's from Michael Crossan. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, whether he talks about that in his letters, I don't know. He does talk about it elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when John Bunyan, whose books are up here, when Bunyan was imprisoned, Owen, one of the periods of imprisonment, Owen did make efforts to contact a man called Thomas Barlow, who was a bishop, and actually a very old friend of Owen, to try and get Bunyan released. And there was all kinds of behind the scenes machinations to try and make that possible. Another story that I've never been able to find confirmation of, comes up in some of the early biographies, is that Owen somehow, I think he was in Tunbridge Wells, of all places, and bumped into James, the Duke of York, who was the king's brother, who then introduced him to the king himself, Charles II. And Owen then had an audience with the king and explained to the king, I think, something about the need facing dissenters. And the king apparently gave him 1,000 guineas for Owen to disburse to poor and distressed dissenters. Something similar, of course, happened in Ireland, the Regium Donum, which the king began to pay to Presbyterian ministers here as well.
Great. Thank you for that. So that answers some of the questions that that have been submitted anyway. So I guess we have maybe about 10 minutes left.
Great.
So we'll maybe just go into the final maybe 2 sections then of the book. Yeah. So starting with chapter 4.
Well, chapter 4 is about death.
I mean, that's obviously
the prospect of eternal life.
Yeah. And we're hearing a lot about that in the news. Yeah. And sometimes when you're reading some of these older theologians and you wonder what translates into our culture and our times, and then you start reading Owen on death and the afterlife, and you think, wow, I mean, that's always a topic, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, Owen obviously wrote a lot about death. He thought a lot about death, but then again, he had buried 10 of his own children, every one of them, either as an infant or, in the case of his daughter Mary, as a woman, probably in her 20s or early 30s. So he buried every single one of his 10 children. His first wife had died. He had buried her. He had seen, inevitably, as he passed in and out of London through the 1660s and 1670s for a period of 20 years, he would have passed by cages above major bridges and gates where parts of the corpses of men who he knew were still being hung up as kind of visible reminders: don't cross this government, this is the power that we have. And in fact, in the early 1660s, when his work was very clandestine, he was being spied upon. And a government spy wrote a report that said that they had found one, along with an independent and a Baptist minister, conferring together in Moorfields where the quarters hung. And it seems to be that they were, or it's at least a possibility, that they were meeting in a part of London alongside these dismembered corpses. So, the prospect of death was real. Of course, 1665, the massive outbreak of bubonic plague, 66, the Great Fire of London. He was living through an incredibly traumatic time, and he preached a great deal about plague and fire. And through the last 20 years of his life, he just kept remembering the experience of plague and the experience of fire. And he says again and again in his books and also in the sermons, these are warnings from God. God is warning you. Sometimes, the way he put it, other times he would argue these are judgments of God. I mean, what other conclusion could he realistically have drawn? For him, in the mid-1660s, having lived through the failure of the revolution, the incredibly bloody, horrific torture and public dismemberment of men that he knew, in front of massive crowds baying for their blood, and then to see 2,000 of, as he would have thought, the best ministers of the Church of England ejected from it, and to see immediately following that a massive outbreak of plague and a fire that destroys some of the central parts of the city of London, inevitably he thought, God hasn't abandoned us after all. He's warning the nation, and he's telling the nation, you've got to stop treating dissenters this way. And he also thought that these were warnings and judgments upon the church. So he wasn't simply blaming the victims, you know. He warned the church that these were judgments on them too. And he said, you know, in his later preaching, he really returns to this theme. God sent a plague and a fire to warn you not to put your hopes in this world. Why are you putting your hopes in this world? You know?
Do you think his preaching then became more direct as he shortened his sermons and maybe got more to the point a little bit quicker? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, he in 1673, his tiny congregation of 30 people merged with a bigger congregation of 100 people thereabouts that had been led by this man called Joseph Carroll. Joseph Carroll is famous for preaching a series on Job that lasted at least 20 years. It's really noteworthy that after Owen's tiny congregation merges this much bigger congregation of 100, he never preaches a sermon series again. Right. And I kind of get the view that after the death of Joseph Carroll, that congregation just breathes this massive sigh of relief that says, right, we want text sermons from now on, which you can understand. But in his later preaching, to go back to the theme of death and eternal life, he speaks a lot about that, because in that tiny congregation of 30, it wasn't getting bigger over the years, it was getting smaller because people in it were dying, and he speaks really directly. You know, one of his sermons, there's an empty seat in front of me. I love this man, I was with him for 20 years. Now he's gone. So he speaks a lot about death, but he also connects death with the experience of the intermediate state, the resurrection, and the vision of Christ, which he sees as the great culmination of Christian experience. So, you know, that the germ of Christian life that's nourished through childhood in a regenerate child, he sees it goes through all the ups and downs of a life that can be incredibly traumatic and unpredictable, but it ends after death safely. And it's safe because that life that passes through death, a Christian, he says, will always die safely, even if they don't die happily. They will always die safely. And they die safely because they belong to Jesus Christ. And, you know, he writes really warmly about the experience of death as the moment when an angel comes to take you into the presence of your Heavenly Father. You know, he writes about that. And he describes the experience of the beatific vision, not of seeing God in the abstract, but of seeing the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And, you know, that again, that's, you know, an interesting switch in terms of Christian tradition. But I think what it shows is not only that Owen is continually paying more attention to what the Bible says than what Aquinas says, it also shows that for him, the great satisfaction of his life and the great hope of his life is knowing that whatever happens, he's going to see Jesus.
Great. Well, that's maybe an appropriate way of sort of concluding our conversation on the book. I just wondered as well, as you were talking there, I mean, we're in a bookshop filled with maybe 120,000 different titles or something.
That aside, you know, in his later life, in the 16th, see him really engaging with rabbinical learning. You know, he's really interested in medieval rabbinical scholarship. He reads all the medieval schoolmen. He reads all the Lutherans that interest him. You know, he's completely up to date with Reformed works. He reads all the kind of nonsense that gets printed that period as well. Of course, in his education, he's reading all the classical authors and he uses them a lot. He uses them for theological purposes as well, takes them really seriously. His library catalogue gets published just after his death for the purposes of an auction, and that shows that he's stocked full of poetry, books about geography, books about history. He's got a book about how to brew beer. He's got absolutely everything under the sun. So he reads everything, but fundamentally, it was the Bible that interpreted every other book that he read. So he reads the classics, the Greek and Roman authors, but doesn't take them at face value. He recognizes that these authors are preserving memories of an original revelation that was given to Adam and that has been corrupted, but it's still there. And there's bits of it are true, and he's always looking for bits of it that are true.
That's great. Yeah. So I think we're going to announce some winners very shortly. I won't announce them personally, but our techies who are sitting in Edinburgh, thanks to you guys, we'll put the winners' names up alongside the comments shortly. So if you've interacted in some way, don't rush off. Do stay online, and you will soon be notified then if you're a winner of some of these books. As we said at the outset, there are 5 copies of Crawford's new book to give away, and really thankful to Crossway, the publisher, for those 5 copies. And there will be a link. I don't know if it has come up just yet, but there should be a link coming, which will tell people listening in the United States exactly where they can purchase the book. Crossway are doing a 50% special offer for a limited period, and the link will appear in due course. We are clearly not as generous as Crossway, but we do have a 25% offer on the book at the moment, and we would...
Including postage.
That's including postage, to anywhere in the United Kingdom, yeah, we'd be glad to it's going out. It is a great book, and I think it is a very helpful starting point for anyone, wanting to delve into Owen's thought, and particularly how that impacts the Christian life. That isn't abstract theology. I think the book is really helpful for any person at any stage in life to pick up. Now, Crawford did reference this one earlier, John Owen and English Puritanism. So we have 2 copies of that away. And again, the winners will be notified shortly through the comments there. So thank you very much, Crawford, for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
No, it's great. It's always good to have you. You've done a few of these author events for us now, and
this is the smallest audience so far.
Yeah, sadly we couldn't have it any other way, but people are out there watching, and the comments are really, we've had a few comments there. John Greer, who is a mutual friend and former manager here, says thank you for the book and interview. Michael Crossan, great interview, and Gary Brown, really helpful. So nice comments there, and it's good to be
Thanks, lads.
It's great to be able to interact with the public. These events are all about bringing us closer to our authors and learning from them more at first hand, and really grateful to you for coming in.
Thanks, Colin.
And thankful to everyone for tuning in. And yep, we will announce those winners shortly, and I think we'll wrap things up there. So thanks again. You probably need to keep that.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you, Crawford.